The morning was cool, like many mornings in December, but the air in the cafe on the corner felt unexpectedly fresh. Carla and I often stopped by here to discuss projects or just talk about life. Sitting across from me, Carla studied my gaze with some strange attention, as if she was searching for something I wasn't even aware of. She took a sip of her coffee, and for a moment, it seemed like she was about to say something, but then she suddenly froze. I returned to my drink, sensing that something intangible hung in the air. "Have you noticed that something strange is going on in the office?" she finally asked. I looked at her, trying to understand what she meant. Something in her tone sounded as if she knew something I didn't. I decided to brush it off. "Yeah, probably just stress, lack of sleep. We're all overloaded." My explanation sounded too confident, but there was something in it that didn't quite match how I actually felt. Carla didn't seem convinced. Her gaze was still fixed on me, and her lips were slightly curled, as if she was waiting for a confession. And then I heard the vibration of my phone in my bag. I pulled it out, and the screen showed Daniel's name, my husband's younger brother. With every message from him, I felt a strange sense of unease. "We need to talk. It's more important than you think." I immediately felt the urge to ignore this message, but I politely placed the phone back on the table, trying to make sure Carla didn't notice. I picked up my cup, not looking at her, and said as though nothing had happened, "It's nothing serious. We just talk about things sometimes. Don't worry." Carla fell silent for a moment, then her eyes became sharper, as if she were trying to read something from my face. Her words almost shocked me. "It seems like you're hiding something." Those words thundered in my head like lightning on a clear day. I couldn't catch my breath. Suddenly, I felt like something was tightening inside me, and that uncomfortable feeling grew stronger with every glance from her. I didn't like how she saw me now, but I couldn't hold back. This silence, it stretched between us like an invisible web, and I began to hate her for it, for the fact that she could feel something was wrong, and I couldn't explain what was happening to me. My head was buzzing, and my chest tightened with an unpleasant foreboding. I lifted my gaze to meet her eyes, trying to keep a composed face, but I realized that I couldn't hide anything. After the cafe, I couldn't shake the thought of Carla's words. All morning they played over in my mind like a broken record, and I felt how everything inside me began to press down, as if I could no longer hide the truth. But what was this truth? Daniel? Or something else? When I stepped outside, it seemed as though the world around me had become a little brighter. I decided to go for a run, even though I hadn't been finding the time for it lately. Perhaps it was an attempt to escape from my thoughts, from that feeling that had been with me since the morning. I was walking through the park when I suddenly heard a familiar voice. It was Daniel. He nearly bumped into me but managed to slow down just in time. His smile was strange, insistent yet restrained at the same time. We rarely met like this, just on a walk, and I always felt like our conversations were more than just random encounters. "You here too?" he said, as if he knew I would be on this path. "Yeah, decided to do a little running," I replied, trying to hide the wave of anxiety. We began walking side by side, and, as usual, the conversation turned to work. But with each question he asked, it became harder to stay calm. "Don't you feel like you need to change something?" he suddenly asked, stopping and looking at me. I tried not to meet his gaze, but his eyes held me, like a magnet. I laughed, trying to hide my nervousness, but in that moment, I realized that his words, his gaze were starting to work on me. It was as if they were tearing away the masks I'd so carefully worn over the past months. And suddenly, I understood that I couldn't keep hiding what I felt. I couldn't just brush off his questions. It was as if he knew exactly what was happening inside me. I don't know, maybe sometimes I do want change, but I stopped, unable to find the words. What was I saying? What did I really feel? "Don't you feel like there's something important between us?" His words sounded as though he were reading my mind. I stopped, as if in slow motion. Suddenly, everything around me grew quieter, and I felt my heart start to race. It wasn't just surprise, it was something far more unsettling. There was power in his question that made me stop and think. I tried to pull away, but I couldn't. This wasn't just curiosity, it was something much deeper. "What do you mean?" I finally asked, not knowing what to say next. He sighed, and his face grew serious. His eyes searched mine for something I couldn't understand. He was silent for a few seconds, then softly said, "I think you're hiding everything from yourself." And suddenly, it became clear. I wasn't in control of what was happening. I couldn't keep everything inside anymore. In the evening, I decided that I just needed to relax. Too much had been happening lately, and I could no longer maintain this internal imbalance. Liza had organized a small gathering at her favorite wine bar, a place that was always quiet and cozy. I arrived a little early, sat at a table by the window and reached for a glass of wine. Soft music, warm lighting, and the usual cozy atmosphere. Everything as usual. Liza approached with a smile, always cheerful and full of energy. But when I looked up, I suddenly found it hard to breathe. Daniel was sitting at the nearby table, and his gaze immediately locked onto mine. It wasn't a coincidence. He noticed me, and his expression shifted, as if he realized I had noticed him. A moment passed, and he gestured for me to join him. I felt my heart tighten. It was impossible to simply ignore this. His presence, his gaze, all of it made me feel like there was something unspoken between us, something sharp and dangerous. I set down my glass and walked over to him, trying not to draw attention. "Do you come here often?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation casual. "Not really, but for some reason I wanted to today," he answered, and there was something in his voice that made me feel as if he knew I wasn't fully present here, as though something much more complicated was happening in my mind. "Have you ever wondered what it would have been like if you had made a different choice?" I fell silent. His question was too pointed to answer easily. I tried to stay calm, but suddenly something shifted inside me. I felt as though the life I had been trying to control was now moving in a different direction, and that terrified me. I tried to laugh it off, but his gaze didn't relent, and his words became more insistent. "Don't you feel like all this is not just a coincidence, that maybe there's something important between us?" he said, his voice now no longer light and carefree. It was almost certain. I was struck by the feeling that he had known the answers to all my questions for a long time, and that I could no longer pretend these encounters with him were just random. I felt his words penetrating me like an inevitable truth, and suddenly it became clear that I couldn't go back. We were left alone. Liza had left for some reason, and now I sat beside him, unable to look away. "Why did you wait so long?" he asked, and I felt his words pass through me like a cold current. At that moment, I didn't know how to respond. It was impossible to answer, because perhaps I had known all along that something wasn't right, but I hadn't wanted to admit it, and I couldn't say it out loud. He looked at me, and I could no longer hide anything, but I didn't know what to do with this knowledge. The realization that everything I thought was right suddenly seemed questionable. The next day began like any other, with fatigue and the sense that I was standing on the edge of something. But as soon as I stepped outside, something strange happened. It suddenly seemed like the world had become a little smaller and simpler, as if all the complex questions had vanished, leaving only one thought: Daniel. I couldn't understand why he kept appearing in my life. Why did his words, his looks, leave such an imprint? The noise of the city seemed distant as I walked down the street, heading toward the center. But unexpectedly, I saw him. Daniel was walking toward me, with that same calm, almost restless gaze. Our eyes met for a few seconds, and I felt that invisible connection between us again. "You're here again?" he said, as though we were always on the same route. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. "Yeah, I decided to take a walk," I replied, though in truth, I didn't know what exactly was drawing me toward him. We started walking side by side, and instead of going our separate ways, as we usually did, we decided to continue the walk together. He chose a longer route, one that I seemed to remember as my own. We walked in silence for a while, but I could feel, with every step, how his presence was affecting me more and more. I couldn't help but notice how his hands clenched into fists, how he walked just a little faster when he sensed that I was falling behind. "Have you ever thought that your life could be different?" he suddenly asked, his voice quiet but firm. I stopped, feeling my heart tighten at his words. He wasn't looking for simple answers. He was searching for something deeper than just surface-level conversation. "I have once," I answered, not sure what he wanted to hear. My heart beat faster. I tried to pull away from the question, but his gaze wouldn't let me escape. He was searching me, as if he knew I was hiding something. He continued speaking, ignoring the internal barrier I had put up, as if he sensed that I couldn't and didn't want to keep living the way I had been. He told me how he had dreamed of traveling but had always been afraid to take the first step. I had once dreamed of that too. We both stood on the threshold of something unknown, but neither of us could step into it. "If it weren't for my brother, my life could have been different," he said, almost confessing something very personal, and I felt his words breaking down the invisible wall I had built between us. And right then, as if by some magical force, I realized that something more had happened between us. This wasn't just a random encounter, not just words. It was real intimacy. We were walking in the same direction, but we both understood that we could no longer be who we were before. I felt the air around us grow denser. I started to understand that there was something between us, something unspeakable, something I could no longer deny, no matter how hard I tried. When we reached my house, I slowed my pace and turned to face him. He stood a little farther back, watching me with that gaze that was increasingly piercing into my soul. I felt strange emotions rising within me, emotions I couldn't contain. I don't know what exactly happened in that moment, but everything I had once considered my world suddenly seemed on the verge of destruction, and I could no longer hide that something inside me was changing, that I could no longer control what was happening between us. My world kept changing, but I still couldn't understand why it had happened. Why now? Why with him? I felt like everything around me was slowing down, and I couldn't keep up with it. Time passed, but inside, I continued to unravel what was happening to me. Then, one evening, Daniel suggested we meet on the roof to talk. He said he had something important to discuss. I didn't know what it was, but an intuition told me that it wasn't just a conversation. I couldn't refuse. Something in his voice was so insistent that I couldn't say no. I arrived a little earlier than we had agreed. From the roof, the city spread out before me, its lights dimming in the cold air. I stood at the edge, breathing in the night sky, when I heard footsteps behind me. He approached quietly, as always, and stood beside me. His presence enveloped me, making everything around me feel more real and significant. Daniel was silent, but his gaze was filled with that same intensity that had been unsettling me for weeks. He took my hand. I felt his fingers tremble slightly. It was strange, this feeling that we were standing on the edge of something important, something irreversible. I began to speak, but the words caught in my throat. His gaze made me fall silent. Everything around us disappeared, leaving only the two of us. He slowly leaned toward me. I felt his breath quicken, his lips almost touching mine. I should have pulled back, but I couldn't. My body no longer obeyed me, and I didn't want it to. When he leaned in, his lips brushed against mine. When the kiss ended, I felt a sharp, cold wind, as though it was waking me from a trance. We were standing on the roof, and I felt that it wasn't just the wind cooling me, but reality itself. It had happened. I couldn't believe it had happened. Everything I had once thought was my life now felt tangled with that moment. I stood there with his hands on my shoulders, and realized that I couldn't simply walk away from what had occurred. This moment had marked the beginning of something new, and I didn't know if I was ready to face the consequences. Daniel remained silent. He didn't ask anything, didn't expect anything from me. We stood in the quiet, and I understood that no words could explain what had just happened. The cold wind that hit us didn't carry away this realization. The wind couldn't erase the emotions that stayed with me, emotions that I could no longer ignore. In the morning, as soon as I entered the office, I felt something was off. The familiar atmosphere, the usual noise, The rustling of keyboards, the phone conversations. Everything seemed distant, not quite the same as before. I walked through the office like a zombie, feeling how every action drained the last of my energy. The meeting I tried to keep under control turned out to be a real test for me. When the day finally came to an end, I felt the vibration in my pocket again. It was Daniel. I couldn't ignore his messages, no matter how hard I tried. His message was simple and to the point. I know what you're feeling, and I can't think about anything else either. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, as if his words were almost a physical reaction. He was right. Neither of us could escape this. We had both become a part of this madness that I had been trying to avoid for so long. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I opened the message. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen, even though I felt as though I was struggling to breathe. With every word he wrote, I understood more and more that this wasn't just a game, not just a random moment. It was something much bigger. He was right, we couldn't go back. And then I realized I had no choice. I couldn't stop this flow. I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Daniel had left me no room. We were both in this now, and I had to figure out how to live with it, how to be with him, with what had started between us. I sat down at my desk and closed my eyes, trying to push away that sense of anxiety, but it wouldn't leave. It felt like a heavy burden I couldn't shake off. I understood that all of this was inevitable, and with every passing hour, my life was becoming more tangled. Everything I knew, I couldn't go back to the life I had before. And that was terrifying. Dinner with Michael was yet another reminder of how fragile every moment in a relationship can be. We sat in our favorite restaurant, in the quiet corner where we once discussed our plans for the future, dreaming of what lay ahead. But that evening, everything was different. As always, Michael brought up the topic of routine, constantly returning to the conversation about how hard things had been for us lately. I knew he felt that something was wrong, but I tried to brush it off as if it were just fatigue. "Don't you notice that we've become completely different?" he asked, his voice serious. I felt a tightness in my stomach. It was too close to the truth. I couldn't hide my thoughts, my feelings, but I tried. I gripped the spoon in my hands and tried to smile. "It's just work. We have a lot to do," I said, but even I could tell that those words sounded empty, unconvincing. Michael was silent, but his eyes kept searching for answers that I couldn't give him. It was as if he could see right through me, and that was the most frightening part. The silence at the table felt like a taut rope. I knew I couldn't lie anymore. He knew something was wrong. When he got up and went into another room, I felt engulfed by a sense of guilt. His footsteps were muffled, and I knew he had felt something. I heard him enter the other room and start talking on the phone. It was an important call, and I knew his words weren't about us. I sat alone at the table, feeling lost. When he returned to the table and said that he felt something was wrong, I realized I couldn't lie anymore. It was over. We were no longer who we had been. Everything I had tried to hide was now obvious. In that moment, I felt the world around me shrink to an unbearable extent. I was ready to lose everything. Michael, my family, my stability. I didn't know how to get through this moment, but I knew one thing. Nothing would ever be the same again. The evening that should have been ordinary became a turning point. We returned home, and despite all the anxiety, I tried to act as though everything was fine. We were home, in that very house where we had so many times made plans, talked about the future. But inside, everything was shattered. All the days I had spent trying to keep my balance, hiding my worry, now seemed absurd. Michael entered the room with a heavy expression on his face. His eyes were filled with questions, and I felt as though he already knew the answers to all of them. He closed the door, sat down across from me without saying a word. We sat in silence. That silence felt so loud to me, I could almost feel it choking me. He looked at me, and I couldn't look away. Finally, he broke the silence, quietly but confidently. "You're hiding something." I froze. Those words hit me like a cold blow. He wasn't saying this with reproach, but with a deep understanding that something had changed between us. But I couldn't say anything. I sat there, not knowing what to answer. He continued, "What's going on? You're not the same." His words were filled with pain and disappointment, and I felt a lump tighten in my chest. I couldn't lie. I couldn't anymore. But I was scared to look into his eyes because I knew that everything I had been hiding was now obvious. I didn't know how to explain what had happened. I didn't know how to say that this wasn't just a mistake, but something much bigger that had seeped into my life and destroyed everything I had once thought was important. "I can't keep going like this," he said, his voice quiet but desperate. I couldn't respond. I couldn't justify anything. I felt as though his words were breaking through my defenses. I couldn't stop it.